She said no to fame, no to film, no to the spotlight, and still became the accidental star whose dancing carried classical ballet to global audiences. Welcome to Hey Dancer. I'm Miller DeRay, your host, writer, editor, researcher, and I'm just so glad you're here for my weekly series, The Rest of the Story, where every single week I bring you the lives of dance legends. If you are excited to learn about these dancers, you can show your support by subscribing on YouTube or following anywhere else you get your podcasts. Speaking of which, I'd love to see some ratings and reviews come in on Apple. So if you are listening there, that would be awesome. And don't forget to do the engagement stuff, like, comment, and share. It all goes a long way. Seriously, it does. Thanks in advance. And now, let's get into it. She was born on January 17th, 1926, at Morton Lodge in Dunfermline, Scotland, her grandparents' home. Her father, Harold, was a civil engineer in the colonial service and came from a strongly musical family. His mother had been a medalist at the Royal Academy of Music, and his father was known for his deep bass voice in London church circles. Now, her mother, Margaret, played both piano and violin and came from a family where nearly everyone could play something. The real center of that world was her grandfather, a gifted violinist and exhibiting artist, and the longtime leader of the Dunfermline Amateur Orchestra. Because her parents spent several years working in Sierra Leone, Africa, she was left in her grandfather's care during her earliest childhood. He gave her her first piano lessons, and by age 4, she could already play a simple tune. In the evenings, she would sit on a small stool with a toy violin, happily imitating the musicians around her, convinced she was a part of the music being played. Those nights, that steady routine of sound and rhythm helped form her sensitive ear and her natural love for art. When, in 1931, she moved with her parents to Andola in northern Rhodesia, it would turn out she never saw her grandfather again, but those years with him remained the most vivid memories of her childhood. It was there, in Ndola, a town on the Copper Belt in Africa, that at 6 years old she took her first dance class. Her teacher's name was Ethel Lacey, who, to support the local fundraising efforts, had just converted her veranda into a makeshift dance studio, which included a ballet bar. Now, Lacey had trained under Enrico Cecchetti, the teacher whose methods shaped dancers like Pavlova and Nijinsky, and whose approach became one of the foundations of classical ballet training. She also held his diploma, a mark of real authority in that lineage. This little girl happened to be one of the youngest there, but she approached the work with a seriousness far beyond her age. Lacey told her parents that when they eventually returned to England, they should place her with a teacher recognized in the ballet world. Soon after, the family left Africa, traveling by German boat up the East African coast on their return to Britain. Back in Scotland, her life returned to something more structured. She attended Bearsden Academy, kept up her music, and did the usual school dancing classes, enough to show promise, but not enough to challenge her. By the time she turned 10, it was unmistakable. Everyone around her could see where her real pull was, and her mother decided it was time for proper ballet training. She was enrolled in a well-known London school run by Flora Fairburn, the place young dancers were often sent before they were considered old enough for the great Russian master, Nicholas Legat. Around this time, a children's novel called Ballet Shoes was published. Written by Noel Streatfeild and completely unlike anything that had existed in children's literature before. It followed the daily training lives of 3 young girls preparing for ballet careers. The story itself was fictional, but the book's illustrations were not. They were created from photographs of real pupils at Miss Fairburn's school. And the youngest character, the red-haired Posy, the one portrayed as the born ballerina, was drawn from her. And that choice wasn't random. Even as a child, she had the kind of coloring people remembered instantly. That vivid red hair against almost translucent skin. She looked like no one else in the room. So when the illustrator needed a little girl who looked like a natural born dancer, they turned to her. It was a small moment in her life, but part of a book that would go on to become a classic of children's literature. And it showed something that would follow her for the rest of her career. Before anyone knew her name, her presence was already unmistakable. And it didn't take long for that impression to travel. After just 3 months of training, she was selected to perform at the Hampstead home of one of Legat's closest friends, a small private showing meant to observe young dancers informally. During the performance, her expression and musicality startled everyone watching. It was as if she had been studying for years at this school, not weeks. And Legat happened to be there for this intimate event. He watched her dance, the musical authority, the phrasing, the expression far beyond her age. And he reportedly said, "This is no beginner." That reaction mattered. Legat was known for not taking children so young. He almost never made exceptions, but in her case, he didn't hesitate. He asked that she be placed in his 5 o'clock class immediately, a level almost exclusively reserved for older, far more experienced students. So, in September 1936, at just 10 years old, she entered Nicholas Legat's training, a decisive turn in her life and the moment her real path began. Legat taught in the pure Russian tradition. Clean placement, disciplined epaulement, strict musical phrasing, and he demanded it from even his youngest pupils. She absorbed it all with a speed that startled him. Her teachers kept repeating the same thing. She worked like someone far older. She remained with Legat until she reached the age when his pupils were normally moved into full professional training. His studio built the foundation, but it wasn't meant to carry dancers all the way into a career, so once she was ready, she was sent to Sadler's Wells School, the academy that trained dancers for the Sadler's Wells Ballet, Britain's leading company at the time. She arrived there around 1940, just as the company and the entire country was bracing for war. And almost immediately, the structure of British ballet was shaken apart. Dancers were called up for wartime duties, companies lost members, and the slow, steady path from school to stage wasn't possible anymore. Because of the wartime shortages, younger dancers were needed sooner. So, at just 14, instead of staying in her daily dance classes at Sadler's Wells School, she was sent out to perform with International Ballet, a touring company formed to keep ballet alive while the major companies struggled with depleted ranks. Those months changed her. She rehearsed in London, opened in Glasgow, and then spent the season touring wartime England, performing through air raids, blackouts, lost scenery, and bitter cold. She danced constantly. The guardian swallow in Planetomania, the fairy of the songbirds in Aurora's Wedding, sometimes learning new parts between a matinee and an evening show, and it paid off. The Dancing Times singled her out for her clarity and musicality, her first real professional notice. So when she returned to Sadler's Wells, now 15 and with a year of wartime touring behind her, she came back not as a schoolgirl, but as a young dancer already carrying real stage weight. And almost immediately, the roles began to follow, one by one, each one making a shift. Her first major lyrical impression came in La Sylphide, where reviewers pointed out the softness and sweep in her upper body. Then came The Quest, choreographed by Frederick Ashton, the man who would become one of the defining creative forces of British ballet. It was the first time he truly saw what she could do. More classical tests followed. She danced Odile in Swan Lake, a role that demands precision and glittering sharpness, and proved she could hold it. Then came Coppelia. She went on for the lead role of Swanhilda at short notice, a part usually carried by a far more senior dancer, and delivered a performance so technically secure and so theatrically alive that it changed how people inside the company spoke about her. Overnight, she shifted from promising to indispensable. And then came the Sleeping Beauty, Aurora, one of the most demanding roles in classical ballet. It tested everything: strength, stamina, balance, musical phrasing, and the ability to command a stage with absolute control. And she delivered. In the months that followed, her standing inside the company shifted quietly but unmistakably. Programs began listing her among the leading dancers, and by the late 1940s, she was regarded as one of Sadler's Wells' principal artists. By her early 20s, critics were already calling her international quality, a term reserved for dancers expected to command major stages, not just local ones. By this point, she had been turning down film offers for months, generous ones, glamorous ones, and she rejected every single one of them. She didn't want a shortcut to fame. She didn't want distraction. And she absolutely did not want to be turned into a film actress. Not yet, maybe not ever. And then came the night that changed everything. A film director, Michael Powell, went to Covent Garden in search of a dancer for a new project. He had made Black Narcissus and A Matter of Life and Death, but this film was different. He needed a real ballerina, someone young, someone on the brink, someone whose dancing was the story. And she was on stage that night, dancing in the Covent Garden repertory, the kind of classical role that showed not just line and technique, but the seriousness of her artistic intent. He watched her, and he finally saw exactly what he had been looking for. When they met, he made the offer: a Technicolor ballet film built around Hans Christian Andersen's dark fairy tale, with an all-star cast and two major choreographers attached. And the central role, the dancer whose ambition drives the story, would be hers. She listened, she deliberated, and she said no. She just didn't want to mix film with ballet. She feared the company would resent her. She feared losing the integrity she had fought for. She feared being misrepresented on screen. And she also doubted she could even act. Powell left. Work continued. Massine arrived at Sadler's Wells to stage The Three-Cornered Hat and La Boutique Fantasque, and that alone was enough to sweep every thought of filmmaking out of her life. Massine was more than a choreographer. He was one of the great architects of 20th century ballet. Working with him was transformative, intense, exhilarating, exhausting, and artistically overwhelming. She danced with him, learned from him, and grew in ways she hadn't anticipated. And then the film offer came back. This time, it wasn't just Powell calling. Massine and Helpman were signing on as well. Massine to choreograph the Shoemaker's Dance, Helpman to choreograph the ballet itself. Sir Thomas Beecham was set to conduct. The Royal Philharmonic would record the score. The film would attempt something no one had ever tried: a ballet conceived for the screen, not simply filmed. And then she heard the most persuasive detail of all. If she didn't reconsider soon, the role in this important British film would go to a ballerina in a foreign company. So, after 9 months of persuasion, she said yes to filming The Red Shoes. She flew to Monte Carlo with Leonide Massine and walked straight into a world that looked glamorous from the outside: the Hotel de Paris, the sporting club, the Mediterranean sun, but felt nothing like a holiday. She had never worked so hard in her life. Up at 4, made up and ready by 5, filming until 7 at night. After dinner, meetings about the next day, then straight to bed. And all of it in a medium she didn't understand, surrounded by actors who were far more experienced than she was. Her answer to the fear of not being believable as an actress was simple: underplay everything. Do nothing she couldn't do truthfully. Her first morning began with the last moment of the film: the run across the terrace and the fall over the balustrade onto the railway lines below. A box was placed behind the railing. She had to run, leap, and make it look like a literal plunge. 3 times she did it. Once she pitched so close to the edge the crew gasped, and she was the only one unfazed. And then came the heat. It was the height of the Mediterranean summer. She wore full Technicolor makeup for 14 or 15 hours a day. She wasn't allowed sunglasses. The camera needed her eyes, and giant mirror-like reflectors surrounded her to lift the shadows. Every dancer on set felt it. Shoes ruined within an hour, tight sagging if she sat down, muscles going slack during long waits even though she had to be ready to dance instantly. After that week, she flew back to England and stepped into the real machine, Pinewood Studios. Up at 5, in makeup by 6:30, on set at 9, and before long came the part she dreaded, the rushes. The first time she saw herself dancing on screen, she was so horrified she nearly quit the film on the spot. She had to be talked into staying, and eventually she forced herself to sit through them because they became useful. They let her see faults she couldn't feel or even see in the mirror, including a long-standing flaw in her pirouettes that her ballet master had never been able to fix. Seeing it on screen made the issue instantly clear, and she was able to correct it within days. It was a testament to her discipline, her eye, and her ability to self-adjust at a level most dancers never reach. But the technical demands didn't ease. There was the harness work, suspended in the air for long, uncomfortable periods. It was exhausting, and she had to stay completely controlled while held in a rigid belt that restricted her breathing and movement. There was the chase sequence near the end of the film, the one with the narrow iron spiral staircase built on a fast-moving turntable. She had to run down it in her red point shoes while the camera dropped beside her at matching speed. Every run left her dizzy, feeling drunk almost, but she had to repeat it again and again until the take matched the director's vision. And then there was, again, the leap over the balustrade. Unfinished in Monte Carlo, so the production completed it back at Pinewood. They wanted to use a double, but she refused. Everything in the film, all the dancing, all her stunts, were executed by her, and she wasn't about to change any of that. For the shot, the crew rigged a 15-foot drop cushioned with hay and heavy mattresses, and she committed to doing it exactly as staged. The first take didn't give the directors what they needed, so she went again. On the second jump, the one that finally captured the shot, she landed straight on her head and wrenched her neck, causing an immediate headache. The impact, the force of coming down that way stayed with her. For years afterward, she had nightmares about that moment. Right in the middle of all this, a small scratch on her side, irritated constantly by costumes and movement, turned into an abscess. She was admitted to the hospital for a minor operation, and it became the only real rest she had all year. She later said those days felt almost peaceful. Quiet mornings, catching up on letters, nurses spoiling her. Then she went straight back to work. And finally came the biggest undertaking of the production, the Red Shoes Ballet itself. Nearly 14 minutes on screen, 6 weeks to shoot, filmed under enormous Technicolor lamps that made the set blisteringly hot. She had to repeat long classical passages again and again, but still make them look spontaneous, alive, and emotionally charged. And unlike most filmed ballets of that era, this one avoided the usual trick work. No fantasy effects, no artificial polish to make the dancing look easier than it was. Any camera adjustments were minimal, never used to cheat her technique. What you see on screen is essentially what she danced. Full out, take after take, classical passages repeated endlessly but still performed with freshness, attack, and emotional clarity. And through all of this, she never stopped being a dancer first. Before filming even ended, she was already back in rehearsal at Covent Garden, working on Massine's new ballet, Mam'selle Angot, dancing the role of the aristocrat, slipping back into company life between shooting days at Pinewood. It said everything about who she was. She didn't finish the film and then return to the ballet world. She split her days between studio lights and the rehearsal studio, protecting the part of herself she feared film might steal. and when filming finally wrapped, the rhythm of her life snapped back instantly. Class, rehearsal, company. And almost immediately, she stepped into one of the defining tests of her early career, Giselle. It's the Hamlet of ballet, a role that exposes everything: dramatic range, technical depth, emotional intelligence. She danced it at Covent Garden, and the next morning, The Times praised her first act as enchanting and her second as outstanding for its poetry and lyricism. For a dancer in her early 20s, it was a milestone, a signal that she wasn't just a rising artist, she was becoming a real interpreter. And only then, with her company work in full swing, the film was released. At the press screening, notoriously cold, quiet affairs, something almost unheard of happened. Halfway through the film, when the ballerina, her, bows at the end of the ballet, the critics applauded. It happened again at the premiere, and at the Venice Film Festival, she became the film's unexpected triumph. Front pages, rave notices, predictions of a major international screen career. Then came the real storm. Reporters at her door, cameramen outside her home, the phone ringing so constantly it had to be disconnected. She fled to Switzerland for a holiday, but was recognized on mountaintops. Producers in Britain and America came after her immediately, starring roles, handsome contracts. She turned every one of them down, because in the end, her priorities never changed. She went back to the bar, back to rehearsal, back to ballet, the thing she had feared losing the moment she agreed to make the film. Her next years at Sadler's Wells were some of her richest. A stretch of demanding classical work that deepened her technique, sharpened her dramatic instincts, and solidified her standing inside the company. And then came a surprise. When George Balanchine staged Ballet Imperial for the company in 1950, she danced the ballerina role in the second cast, an assignment that had raised eyebrows simply because the work had been built around the company's rising star, Margot Fonteyn. But Balanchine's swift neoclassical style fit her so naturally that critics later remarked how completely she seemed to inhabit it. It was one of the clearest signs of how seriously the wider ballet world regarded her, not as a film star, but as a dancer of real international weight. Years later, she would write an entire book, Ballet Master, describing Balanchine's rehearsals and the way his work had expanded her sense of her own artistry. And then, slowly, film found her again. Her first film after The Red Shoes was The Tales of Hoffmann, and her name appeared above the title. For someone who had walked away from Hollywood offers, it was proof of just how powerful her impact still was. One film had made her a name people would pay to see. And in this movie, she danced two roles. As Stella, the dream figure ballerina, her movement was all warmth and sweep, the kind of lyrical phrasing that made even stillness feel musical. And then came Olympia, a mechanical doll brought to life. Here, her dancing snapped into something entirely different. Footwork clipped and fast, timing razor precise, her body hitting angles with unnerving accuracy, strength, agility, musicality, speed, all compressed into the eerie brilliance of an automaton who moves too perfectly. Two characters at opposite ends of the spectrum, and she made both believable, both alive. MGM came calling next, a film told in 3 parts, and she anchored the first. The segment, The Jealous Lover, cast her as a young ballerina whose life collides with a choreographer's in a brief, tragic encounter. It gave her more than one chance to dance on screen. Classical passages shaped around Rachmaninoff shot in rich Technicolor, letting her move through long lines, sweeping phrasing, and that unmistakable lyricism she carried so naturally. The result remains one of the rare moments Hollywood put classical ballet on camera without diluting it, a luminous example of a dancer carrying her art cleanly across the border between stage and cinema. Then came The Man Who Loved Redheads. Her Charleston, light, witty, and unexpectedly assured, caught everyone off guard, a burst of musical playfulness no one saw coming. And when the film pivoted into a Sleeping Beauty pas de deux, she slipped back into pure classical line. The sequence critics later said she held together through sheer clarity and control. Then came Peeping Tom, and with it one of the strangest, most unsettling dance moments of her career, and honestly ever caught on film. She appears in a rehearsal studio, dancing a loose, modern, almost Graham-inflected routine, playful, giddy, full of long lines and sudden leaps. Her character is unaware that the cameraman filming her is about to kill her. The scene works as a dark mirror to the red shoes. Once again, she dances toward a fatal end. But here, the movement is jazzy, improvisational, almost carefree, which makes the danger closing in feel even more chilling. It showed her versatility with startling clarity. How easily she could shift from classical purity to modern tension without losing any of her musicality or control. Then came Black Tights, a French anthology of 4 ballets choreographed by Roland Petit, one of the major modern voices in mid-century ballet. In the Cyrano de Bergerac segment, she played Roxanne, dancing with a sharper, more theatrical clarity than audiences knew from her early classical years. Crisp lines, dramatic angles, movement shaped for the camera rather than the stage. It's one of the few films that preserve her later dancing, showing how her technique didn't fade after the red shoes. It only deepened. As the years went on, she danced less, but she never stopped completely. And in 1987, long after anyone expected to see her on a stage again, she returned to create the role of Lowry's mother in Gillian Lynn's A Simple Man. She was 61. The red hair was still unmistakable. And what she brought to that performance wasn't virtuosity, it was presence. Luminous, centered, and unmistakably that of a dancer who had never let the instinct leave her body. It was a final, quiet reminder of what had always set her apart. For years afterward, she insisted she had not been ready for the red shoes. She said the same thing again and again, that if the film had been made 2 or 3 years later, she would have been a different dancer. A stronger one, a more mature one. She judged herself with the same severity she brought to every rehearsal. She never believed the film showed the dancer she was becoming, but everyone else saw something she didn't. Michael Powell, the film's co-creator, said, "The movie would not have been possible without her," and history proved him right. Her performance became the image that carried ballet into the wider world. A dancer whose musicality, attack, magnetism, and purity of line made classical technique feel immediate and alive to audiences who had never set foot in an opera house. The Red Shoes is still considered by many to be the most influential dance film ever made. As but one example, it was voted the 9th greatest British film of all time by the British Film Institute. And directors like Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, and Steven Spielberg credit the film with shaping their own visual language. And her presence at its center is impossible to separate from that impact. For generations of young dancers, she became the spark, the catalyst. Countless young artists cite the Red Shoes as the moment they first understood what ballet could be: bold, dramatic, cinematic, and performed without a single concession to the camera. Her dancing didn't just survive the lens, it electrified it. What she created was a performance so immediate, so alive, that it became larger than the film itself. But with all that said, her legacy isn't this movie, it isn't the fame. It's that when the world tried to crown her a star, she walked straight back into the studio. Class, rehearsal, the daily discipline that had shaped her long before any camera. And that almost never happens. Most dancers, most artists in general, would be tempted by the attention, the offers, the money, the sudden spotlight. But not her. She went back to the bar. And that is the part that truly endures. and should not be forgotten. The thing that almost no one talks about, that at the height of her popularity, she stayed rooted in the craft itself, the dance life she built in the studio, the one she continued to honor long after the performance that reshaped how ballet lived on film. Her name, Moira Shearer. And now you know the rest of the story.